Hi, everyone. I'm Claire Vath, and I'll be your host for this Successful Farming webinar showcase with Yara. Yara is a crop solutions provider that specializes in nitrogen fertilizer, and today I'm joined by Dr. Trey Cutts, Market Development Director at Yara North America. We'll be having a conversation about how crop nutrition products from Yara can take your yields and your ROI to the next level. So thanks, Trey, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Claire.
So Trey, growers often face the challenge of maximizing crop yield while still maintaining operational efficiency and profitability. And with the right crop nutrition applied efficiently and effectively, that balance is achievable and growers can produce their best yields in crops. But micronutrients are often overlooked when it comes to that crop nutrition, but really they're the key to ensuring the highest crop quality and yield. So can you speak a little bit about why micronutrients are so critical for a complete crop nutrition program?
Well, I think you said it, Claire. Our growers today are asked to produce much more with less. I think if you look at our yield trends over the past 75 years, they are far from static. And they are only going to increase over time. And this has not been achieved by putting more acres in production. This has been achieved by being more efficient, more productive on a smaller number of acres. And if you actually look at the individuals that are breaking these thresholds, most recently David Hula in Virginia, he'll describe in the article that's shown on the slide, this is not because he had a magic piece of dirt, quote unquote. He actually did this on very sandy, infertile soils. So what that tells you was he was able to break that 600 bushel yield record by actually having a very intense, very proactive management approach, especially when it comes to crop fertility. And you also made a good point that, micronutrients are often overlooked or considered a luxury or a secondary thing that, if I'm able to include, maybe I will, but, not a big deal. But if you look at, the increased amount of productivity on a smaller amount of acres, and also, the intensity of, plant densities and just the ability of plants to extract nutrients out of smaller space and in a shorter amount of time at times, we have to consider micronutrients mandatory. And micronutrients are not a new thing in plant physiology, right? They've always been needed for key growth factors in our crops. It's just only now, I think, are we actually, realizing the limit of soil to provide those micronutrients to do all the key things that we need for high yielding crop, standability, root development, maximizing photosynthesis, and of course, in terms of corn ear formation and grain fill.
So with that in mind, what's the most effective and efficient way to actually apply those micronutrients?
Yeah, so if you think about why they're called micronutrients, right, it's because they're needed in smaller amounts. Now, that doesn't mean a lower level of importance. It just means the actual volume that the plant utilizes. And actually, we're talking about grams per acre here. We're not talking about hundreds of pounds per acre, like our traditional NPK, based fertility programs. So that's why Yara, keeping, production efficiency in mind, finding ways to maximize, getting micronutrients into the plant in an efficient way. Yara developed YaraVita PROCOTE, which is a oil-based micronutrient coating designed to complement an existing dry NPK program. Okay, so what this is allows it to do first, being an oil-based product, it automatically improves handling, spreadability, and reduces dust in those fertilizer blends, which is huge from a retail perspective, but also from a grower's perspective, to make sure that the application is clean, uniform as possible. But more importantly, I think is the nutrition that we're able to provide with minimal complexity. We're not asking growers to decide between, okay, now I should have to apply this product or, totally shake up what their existing dry program is. PROCOTE is designed to complement existing programs and eliminate the complexity. And if you look at, being able to do that either with a targeted nutrient or a complete micronutrient package, it really gives growers the flexibility and the efficiency to provide micronutrients to the plant, when we know they need them, and most importantly, where they need them.
So Trey, how have micronutrients typically been applied in the past?
Yeah, and like I said, micronutrients are not a new thing. They've been in our production systems for a while, but traditionally they've gone out in dry granular form, but in conjunction with our NPK blends. And the drawback with that is that anytime you have a blend based of fertilizers, you have segregation, you have particle separation in the blend. But why this even more matters for micronutrients is if you think about, putting, 20 pounds of, say, zinc sulfate, in a 1 ton blend, where is that 20 pounds in that blend, and, where does it come out? And again, if you think about, okay, the rate of micronutrients that you're applying, 5 pounds an acre, when we're talking about uptake and removal values of zinc, being in the grams per acre, that's far from being efficient. So why do those high rates exist? It's simply to overcome the inefficiency of the distribution of those micronutrients. But you'll find, when you have that even distribution, when you're applying hundreds of pounds of your NPK and micronutrients are on every single particle, your ability to deliver micronutrients becomes much more efficient, and you can get closer to what the plant actually needs. And also, if you think about, when PROCOTE is applied to, acidifying fertilizer, when it's in that zone of microacidification, it really works to increase the solubility and availability of those micronutrients, where, in a blend, you don't know where they are or when they're available over time. And, one last thing, micronutrients and their deficiencies or availability in the soil varies greatly over space. And to be honest, our even soil sampling techniques are not granular enough to know, is there a deficiency, from this part of the field to the next. We try to overcome that through different sampling techniques, but at the end of the day, those the variance that exists is beyond what we're able to sample. Combine that with, a dry application where you might have particle separation, in that blend. You actually don't know where that zinc is going to land, and is it going to land in this part of the field that you need it? It's just a huge unknown. So being able to have that increased micronutrient distribution, increase that micronutrient solubility at the feeding site, allows for maximum root proliferation over those zones, and in turn aids in micronutrient uptake tremendously.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about micronutrients. Macronutrients such as nitrogen and sulfur continue to be critical for crop production. So can you talk about some of the ways growers can improve how they apply their nitrogen and their sulfur?
Yeah, and that's also an interesting line of thought. When you think about nitrogen and sulfur, they have so many synergies in the soil and in the plant. And continuing that line of thought of a homogeneous product, likewise, it's important for micronutrient distribution. It's also important for nitrogen and sulfur for maximizing those synergies in the soil and in the plant. So along those lines, again, Yara developed YaraVera AMIDAS, which is a homogeneous granule of urea ammonium sulfate. And what that means is every granule that's applied has the same analysis of nitrogen and sulfur, which again is hugely critical to maximize the synergies that exist with nitrogen and sulfur. And again, really aids nitrogen use efficiency in the end. We also know that nitrogen and sulfur are needed in fixed ratios in all of our plants. And the ratio that AMIDAS is able to deliver with a 7.3 to 1 N/S ratio is extremely ideal for most of our broadacre cropping systems. And one important distinction with AMIDAS that I'll make is it's not a sulfur-coated urea. Where sulfur-coated urea is designed, for a slightly different purpose, AMIDAS is actually designed to deliver sulfur nutrition, which you cannot achieve with a sulfur-coated urea.
Okay. So you mentioned the AMIDAS is a homogeneous granule. What does that mean exactly from a crop nutrition perspective?
Yeah, and I think, to have the discussion around crop nutrition, you also have to talk about, the application and the handling that brings, which then in turn leads to the crop nutrition benefits. But, simply if you're going to visualize a homogeneous product versus a blend, first you'll see kind of the physical properties, in a blend that's on the picture on the right, and you'll notice just different particle sizes between a urea and ammonium sulfate. So if you think about those going out the back of a blend or a back of a spreader, it's kind of like the physics between throwing a baseball and a wiffle ball. Those don't go the same distances when you put the same arm strength behind them. So if you think that in the context of providing nutrients in an equal ratio in a known place in the field for uptake, a blend often falls short. But to even think about that a little bit further, thinking about what happens when a blend comes out the back of a spreader, and think about those different particle size and densities, they simply will throw at different widths. And unfortunately, we see too much of the yellow and dark green streaking in a lot of our fields, and it's easy to blame the spreading operator, right? You think, well, how did he miss those passes? But oftentimes those streaks are so uniform. Actually, I'd say he had to be a dang good spreader operator to hit those streaks that consistently. But really what it is, it's the inconsistency is not the spreader operator, it's the inconsistencies in the blend. And so when you have a homogeneous product, especially for nitrogen and sulfur, you're able to have a consistent spreading width further at times and eliminate that streaking in the field, which is not only damaging to the eye, it's also damaging to yield potential because you're over and underdosing the field at the same time.
So you mentioned there's a synergy between nitrogen and sulfur that influences the nitrogen use efficiency. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, and forgive me if we go too deep into some of the soil chemistry and physiology, but we'll give it a shot. But it's worth talking about. First there's a synergy in the soil chemistry, and if you think about ionic balance or electrical neutrality, what does that mean? It means that different nutrient particles have different charges to them. So when you have a positive anion, such as ammonium, with a negative anion, such as sulfur, they essentially work together for plant uptake in the soil. They're not antagonistic to each other. I mean, you think about the opposite ends of a magnet. If you have two positive charges against each other, they just work against each other for uptake in the plant and in the root. So especially when you have those in a homogeneous particle where they're right there, that those nutrients are going to be going into the point of uptake at the same time. That's critically important to maximize nitrogen use efficiency, and we've seen that in a lot of our work over the years. But secondly, and probably more importantly, there's a physiological synergy with nitrogen and sulfur in the plant. And I alluded to, plants, we know plants need nitrogen and sulfur in fixed ratios. And that is simply because, of the plant biochemistry that we know exists. Plants utilize nitrogen and sulfur together to build proteins and DNA in the plant. They actually form, are in the same chains. Sulfur forms some of the bridge bonds in DNA. So, without that proper ratio, you're not building those DNA and protein particles. So when you apply them together, that in essence helps you achieve those top yields, because you're not missing out on having enough nitrogen but not having enough sulfur to maximize your protein production, or vice versa. And it causes actually an interesting balance structure between the two parts. We often talk about balanced nutrition, and what does that mean exactly? Well, I mean, it's no more evident than in nitrogen and sulfur, essentially because of the things I was describing. An excess of one will, and in turn, cause a deficiency in the other, right? So if you've got enough nitrogen in the plant to keep going, keep producing proteins, keep conducting photosynthesis, but there's not enough sulfur there to keep up, you're inherently going to see a sulfur deficiency. And that goes vice versa. If you've got more sulfur, or your sulfur to nitrogen ratio is out of whack, that plant is going to be saying, okay, well, I've got all the sulfur to form my bridge bonds for my DNA, but where's all my nitrogen to complement that? And then it's going to show a nitrogen deficiency. So it's not about, well, I'm going to cure a sulfur deficiency with more nitrogen. You're never going to do that. It's got to be in balance, and especially with nitrogen and sulfur. And those balances, or those ratios are very well known in the literature out there, and that's what AMIDAS, in a sense, is designed to do and to meet those demands. I mean, and really, if you take all of those attributes together, having enhanced nitrogen and sulfur uptake, having a harder granule in AMIDAS. If you think about the dust coming out of the back of the spreader, if any of you go on the Yara website, we've got videos of that coming out the back, and how clean of spread that is, but also what kind of spreading width you can get with that harder granule. Again, it's like the baseball and the wiffle ball, which is going further. So if you're able to throw 100 feet versus 90 or 80 feet, that's less time in the field. That's less trips across the field. So if we talk about, production efficiencies, it's not only in the agronomics. Sometimes it's actually in the logistics of getting over a field, with which AMIDAS helps to improve. And again, I can't emphasize enough the benefits you get from a homogeneous product without that segregation. I think anytime you can use any homogeneous product, you're going to be better off in your production systems. It's not always possible, right, because of economics and all those things. When you talk about an NPK, for instance, we often don't have homogeneous P and Ks in our broadacre crops, at least. But anywhere where you can eliminate a blend and provide core nutrition in a homogeneous form with AMIDAS, complemented with PROCOTE. I mean, if you think about, if you complement AMIDAS with PROCOTE, you could get up to 5 nutrients in one particle if you use AMIDAS with a combination PROCOTE product. I mean, that's incredible, and we're able to do that efficiently in broadacre crops, which is especially unique. But again, going back to the beginning, why all this is important, it's because producers are out there are being tasked with doing the impossible, with breaking yield barriers on less land. And we as an industry actually need to equip ourselves to help them do that. And we want to be partners in that. And that's our philosophy and why we design these products. Absolutely.
So, can you talk a little bit about how these products will fit into a typical Midwest farm?
Yeah, and again, there's no boilerplate program, and everyone has their own management practices, which need to be addressed. But let's just say, even if we're sticking with a fall anhydrous ammonia, and then you're going out with your pre-plant NPK, that is an amazing opportunity to get micronutrients out early in the season. Again, looking at that proactive approach, oftentimes by the time we take tissue samples, if a deficiency is there, how long has it been there? It might have been there from germination. So being able to provide early season micronutrients, across the field can be extremely impactful for getting a good start in a growing season. And then, AMIDAS is a fantastic top dress product. To provide that nitrogen and sulfur in a really good ratio. And if you look at kind of the uptake curves of nitrogen and sulfur, about side dress time, that's when they start to peak up. So, AMIDAS is a great pre-plant applied too, if that fits in your program. But at minimum, if it's still fall anhydrous and pre-plant P and K, AMIDAS is great to have at top dress. But don't forget too that you can complement AMIDAS with PROCOTE. And if you're looking at corn and you start off with a balanced micronutrient package to start the season, but you really want to target zinc, which we know is especially critical in corn, that provides the opportunity to do that at side dress as well.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we have a few questions from some of our viewers. So how do we know if the soil isn't giving the crop enough micronutrients?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. And I think, as far as we've come in our management practices, we still have a long way to go. Soil testing can only get us so far. You're not creating, full, soil maps of micronutrients in most cases. And tissue testing is also an excellent tool to fine tune your management. If you look at any of the high yield growers, they're all tissue testing and adjusting their management practices in season. But there's still inconsistencies, right? And there's still, unknowns. But what we do know is what the crop removes from the field. We know what it's going to extract based on certain yield potential. So the way to eliminate that uncertainty is to start with what you know. Provide the plant with what you know it will utilize during the season, so it's not being deprived at any point in the growing season of what it needs. And that's your best shot at not leaving yield on the table.
Okay. Another question is, you said AMIDAS is not a sulfur-coated urea. So how does AMIDAS compare to slow-release products?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'd probably start by backing up a bit and actually address the definition of what is slow release. If you think about sulfur-coated urea, I would almost classify that as a delayed release. It's far from, once that sulfur coat destructs, that's when you have automatic release of nitrogen. So that's beyond slow. That's just delayed and then automatic. The other definition is controlled release. And I want to be clear, a controlled release product is something that has a polymer coat that definitely has a controlled release over time based on temperature and moisture. But what I think is most important, I think fighting through all that terminology, it's providing the nutrition that the crop will need at the time it needs it. And if you look at, the demand curves and when we're able to pre-plant and split apply, I think it's more important to focus on the right nitrogen source that provides nitrogen and sulfur in the right time. I don't want to confuse with a sulfur coated that destructs and in the end really isn't providing the sulfur nutrition that it needs. I like to focus on, what is the core and the best nitrogen and sulfur source that you can use. And in my opinion, that's AMIDAS.
Okay. Can you just briefly elaborate on the need for proactive micro crop nutrition versus applying in season to address issues?
Yeah, and again, I'm not taking away from tissue sampling and adjusting your management in season based on the conditions. It's absolutely necessary because there's still so many unknowns in our production systems from a soil chemistry and a plant biology perspective. There's just too much for us to fully predict what's going to happen. But I will say the best way to set ourselves up for success is to be proactive. Again, know what your crop is going to potentially extract. Know your high productivity areas versus your low productivity areas, and just work to minimize your chance of having a deficiency in the system. And that's what a proactive approach is all about. Okay.
Well, Trey, thanks so much for joining me and sharing such great insights from Yara. And thanks to all our viewers for tuning in today. We hope that some of this crop nutrition ideas discussed here will be of value to your farm operation and maybe help take your yields and your ROI to the next level. So on behalf of Successful Farming and Yara, have a wonderful day.